Yeah, so please, as I said, please feel free to sort of stop and say, go over this or whatever. Okay. All right. So then let's do a very quick thing of what do we mean when we say a structure of caste, what do we mean when we say the structure of gender, and then I'll try and see how we can sort of put them together. What are the mechanisms through which they work together, right? Now we all know, the structure of caste, and I want to just point out two or three important sort of signposts in that sense of what we understand by the system or the structure of caste, right? So one and of course it's been very 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 interesting the ways in which the knowledge about caste itself has been produced. And that's sometime you should actually have someone come and talk to you about the history of the way in which caste as a subject of knowledge has been constructed within sociology in India, anthropology in India, so on and so forth. Because for a very long time, the understanding of caste was based on a certain notion of consensus, right? So caste was understood merely in terms of this sort of a system of purity and pollution, but also primarily understood as a system of consensus, right? Where it was assumed in that sense that everyone consented to their to their position within the caste structure, within the caste system, and that so we have a lot of writing that looks at caste as the structuring principle of Indian society in a good way, quote unquote good way, in the sense that it provides stability, it allows for reproduction of society, etc., etc., right? And obviously that is not that's a very very problematic sort of framework of producing knowledge about caste. It has much to do again with the questions of who produces knowledge, right? So when largely in that sense the knowledge about caste was produced by those who have been powerful, and who then went on to become in that sense these native informers for European sociologists who are now producing like Dumont, who were now producing knowledge about caste. There was a very different notion of caste, a consensus based notion of caste, caste as the stabilizing sort of influence, allowing for the reproduction of the social order, so on and so forth, right? But of course, one of the first, and I mean, you have a whole history of them. I'm sure you heard Dr. Redkar talk about some of them, but beginning from Phule, you have a whole history then of anti-caste radical revolutionaries, Phule, Ayutthaya, Periyar, and of course Dr. Ambedkar. A long history of people who started actually questioning this sort of an understanding, this common sense understanding of caste as a system of purity and pollution, but also majorly as a system of based on consent, right? Based on consensus and consent. And so four things about it that I want to just sort of flag. So yes, there is as you go higher up in the hierarchy of caste, there is a notion that there's a notion of purity, there's a notion of pollution as you go high, go down. This is also accompanied therefore by a structure of respect and contempt, which is how it works. And that's very important for us to understand, therefore, that caste then is a system of graded inequality. So it's a system of graded hierarchy, right? And Dr. Ambedkar very interestingly talks about how this graded nature, right? The fact that you always have someone who is above you and someone who is below you, right? That system of caste is not a binary system. It's a system of graded inequality, where you will always have someone above you, but you will always have someone below you. And Dr. Ambedkar actually talks about how the graded inequality of the caste system actually stops people who are oppressed within the caste system from actually creating solidarity, right? So he actually says that the graded nature of this hierarchy sort of undermines any possibilities of solidarity, right? So it's a system of graded inequality. Yeah. Secondly, as we have and we often hear it, and even today there are people who will say, the caste system was just a division of labor. You always need a division of labor in society. Society is always made up of different parts. Each part should have its own function, and therefore caste was just that. It was just giving a function to every part of this thing. It's only sometime down the line that it became rigid and it became oppressive, but otherwise it was just a division of labor, right? And to that again, we have to go back to Dr. Ambedkar for the insight where he tells us that it's not just a division of labor, it is a division of laborers. Because what caste does, so caste does not stop just at the point of becoming a way in which you make occupational division. That occupational division is hierarchical, and that occupational division then becomes the basis of your sense of the social. And I think that is the most important thing for us to understand. The fact that this sort of an occupational segregation then also becomes social segregation, right? Where your entire sense of the social, your entire sense of who is your community, your entire sense of, in that sense, sociability, then gets restricted to the question of caste, right? So you marry within caste, you socialize within caste, you live with other caste members. Your entire sense of the social, what constitutes therefore the social, is completely limited by the question of caste, right? And again, if we read Dr. Ambedkar, he is therefore very, very, I mean, whether he's looking at the question of the Constitution of India, whether he's looking at the question of, how to bring about political democracy in India, he constantly keeps referring to the fact that, yes, I will. He constantly keeps, referring to the idea that what is the biggest problem in a sense with Indian society is that there is no possibility of fraternity. There's no possibility, therefore, of a social community in the Indian context, because our sense of the social is entirely subsumed by the question of caste. Okay. Now, to just answer very quickly, Vasudha, your question, it's a long, it's a long question, and we have many different ways, many different theories actually of how that came to be. But I will just very quickly tell you what Dr. Ambedkar has to say about it. And, you can go and read about it, in detail later. For Dr. Ambedkar, this transition in many ways of what might have begun as a more loosely structured sort of a division of labor into a social organization, for him happens with the triumph of Brahminism over Buddhism, right? So he talks about the coming in of Buddhism as a social revolution in ancient India, where possibilities actually of moving out, because with, I mean, and as I said, I don't have the time to go into the details of it, but what he argues is that, with, for instance, the Buddha's idea of the Sangha, right? There's a new way of imagining actually the social, and Buddhism actually provides for many groups which are oppressed by Brahmanism to sort of find a way out. I mean, Buddhism becomes an exit, and it's it's actually the triumph of Brahmanism through actually at a later point in time. I mean, the codification of the laws of Manu, and also the takeover of political power from Buddhist kings back to Hindu Brahmanical kings. That's where, in that sense, the transition happens. That is where actually you have the codification of rules of caste, and that's where the Manusmriti comes in, and the Manusmriti, in that sense, makes rigid these kinds of classifications where there might have been some sort of a flexibility in the past. And as I said, we have, I mean, there are many different theories of how that came to be. But what we definitely do see is that by the time we come into the colonial period, and now of course post that, caste emerges therefore not just as a occupational hierarchy. It emerges therefore very much as a social hierarchy, where yes, caste defines occupation, but caste also defines therefore all other aspects of your social life, right? So all other aspects of your social life, in terms of who you marry, who you sit with, who you eat, who you whatever, all of these continue to, in that sense, be constituted through your caste. So much so, as I said, that caste becomes your only sense. So I mean, in a lot of Indian languages, I mean, I know this for a fact about Marathi. I'm sure it's also true for very others. That you have actually what's the thing? Uh, So in many Indian languages, so like the word samaj, right, which we use for society, is also actually the word that is used, for caste, right? So people will talk about amcha samajat काय चालतं काय चालत नाही in terms of what is permissible within the caste community. And there is actually no other word. I mean, there is no distinction in that sense of the word that you use for the caste community and the word that you use for society at large, right? Yes. And there's a lot of controversy. Like I said, I'm not, I'm not saying that that's the historical fact. Like I said, there are a lot of theories about it, and there has been a lot of, back and forth on Dr. Ambedkar's work. But I think that it's a useful way of thinking about. And we definitely do know that, and if we read the Manusmriti, we definitely do know that codification in that sense is something that happens, happens in that sense at that point in time, right? And of course, this imagination then of Buddhism as, and again, these are different interpretations then of what that moment of Buddhism meant. You have some who will argue that it is not true. Many others, and there are people working on it even now. I mean, you have Uma Chakravarti's work in progress, where she looks at a Buddhist text and Buddhism, and how does it in that sense constitute the possibility of a revolt against Brahmanism, and why is it then that Dr. Ambedkar picks on that idea, right? So there are, as I said, many different interpretations of it. I find Dr. Ambedkar's a particularly good way of starting to think about it. Not because and I think that there the important question is not so much quote unquote historical fact, as in that sense the ways of reading and interpreting, right? So yeah. All right. So we are saying therefore that so caste is therefore a structure of graded inequality. It's not just a division of labor; it's a division of laborers, as we said. And both occupation and cultural traditions are sort of shaped through that, and therefore it becomes a hierarchy, and a sort of pyramid, where as you go higher up in the hierarchy, there's a concentration of privileges. As you go down in the hierarchy, there is in that sense a concentration of disabilities, right? So that's broadly what's happening. Now, where does gender fit into all of this, right? I mean, that's really the big question that we need to sort of look at. We know, of course, the hierarchy of gender, in terms of whatever. No? It's not just therefore a hierarchy between biological men and women. It's about masculinities and femininities and so on, right? And I'm not really going to go into gender as a structure. I'm going to assume that we are sort of, all on the same page with that. So I'm going to only look at, in that sense, the practices or the structures by which caste and gender intersections were sort of constituted. Okay, and the first and foremost, and the most important in that sense point for us to understand the ways in which these work with each other is the question of endogamy. Okay. Now, do you all understand the word endogamy? Endogamy, exogamy are two anthropological terms which basically talk about what we would commonly call a marriage circle, right? So you have all. I mean, you have a notion of what is the out group, right? The group that you can marry within or you should marry within, and the group that is excluded in that sense from marriage circles, right? Now, so you have often caste endogamy and village exogamy, right? Which is to say that you don't marry within the same village, so that is considered to be in that sense, a group that is outside of your marriage circle, but you marry within caste, right? And this caste endogamy is the most important sort of way in which, or the most important sort of, strategy actually through which the intersections of caste and gender work. Okay. Now, how is this? Why endogamy? I mean, what is the whole question of endogamy? Now, if we understand, like I said, caste is graded inequalities. It's a system of graded hierarchy. It's also a system by which you have bounded groups, right? So caste is also a bounded group. Caste is a closed group, right? It's only when you can maintain, in that sense, the boundaries of caste in any real sense, that you can actually talk about the existence of caste as something that is right. So caste is therefore it's a bounded, it's a bounded group, right? It's a bounded entity, and therefore, how do you maintain, in that sense, the bounded nature of that caste? How do you reproduce caste? How do you, in that sense, maintain the fact that this is a closed group? You only are able to do that through endogamy, which is to say, you marry within the caste. It's only when two individuals of the same caste marry each other that they produce a child who belongs to the same caste. Now, if you look at actually the rules of what is called misogyny, or intermarriage between caste groups, you will see that there's again a whole variety of rules that determine then what is the caste of the progeny, right? But as far as reproduction of the caste is concerned, if you want to reproduce the next generation of the caste, the only way in which you can do it is if two individuals who belong, and in this case, of course, it's not just individuals, a man and a woman belonging to the same caste, when they reproduce the child of the same caste, right? So what happens then is that caste, the existence of caste and the continued existence of the caste then gets predicated on the possibility of regulating and controlling the sexuality of women. Okay, so the only way in which you can ensure the reproduction of the caste in its purest quote unquote form is by ensuring that the access to the sexuality of the women of your caste group is only to the men of your own caste, right? And endogamy, caste endogamy, as the primary rule of marriage, then becomes the primary strategy also of reproducing caste. And you can already start seeing how then control over women's sexuality, and therefore the question of gender, is central to the ways in which castes imagine their own reproduction, right? And so who controls the critical resource of female sexuality? How is that resource sort of constructed? What ideologies sanction and legitimize this control? All of this becomes very, very crucial in the whole process of the reproduction, in that sense, of caste, right? So it's because you want to keep caste as a discrete unit, right? The bounded nature of caste, and therefore the exchange of women, right? Because it's through the exchange of women that kinship is produced. So therefore, the question of marriage circles becomes extremely crucial, right? And so, in fact, like I was saying, if caste was a social circle, or caste was also a social system, you often hear caste being spoken about in terms of roti beti vyavahar, right? It's always the practices of interdining and intermarrying, right? And what you do see is that though there has been an opening up in some ways of the structures of caste as far as the roti vyavahar is concerned, which is intermingling, interdining, because in that sense, in a modern democratic society, you cannot refuse to, and we still see cases of that. I'm not denying that, but by and large, you cannot refuse to intermingle. So intermingling to an extent opens up, but beti vyavahar, which is to say, marriage relationships continue to be structured for the most part, even today, along lines of caste, right? And you just have to look at like matrimonial columns. You go online and you look at any number of matrimonial sites which are structured around community. So you have specific matrimonial sites. So anyway, I mean, if you watch that Indian Matchmaking, if you haven't, you should. It's a really bad show, but it's very educative in terms of how is it that caste and gender actually intersect in the ways in which we think about what is suitable matches even today, right? So what you see is that endogamy then becomes a way of ensuring that caste is reproduced, right? That means you need to put restrictions on the sexuality of women, right? Because what you're trying to do is institutionally, you are trying to institutionally ensure that the access to women's sexuality is restricted to the men of your own community, Okay. Now, again, and so which is why you also see, practices, and that's again a very, very fascinating history of what we come to see as the social reform movement in colonial India, is almost entirely focused actually on the disabilities, social disabilities that are faced by upper caste women, especially Brahmin women, because these are customs which have been introduced with a very clear sort of an idea of keeping their sexuality under control, right? And again, Dr. Ambedkar very interestingly, frames it as a question of excess men and excess women. So he's saying that, if you are a bounded group, you are a group that wants to close off its borders, which means you want to, marry within that caste group. You want to ensure that, all marriages happen within that circle. Then, if there is an imbalance in terms of the number of marriageable men and the number of marriageable women, you're always going to have a problem, right? And so you need to manage the excess women, he says. And how do you manage the excess women? How do women become excess? They will become excess if they are widows, for instance. And so how do you manage that excess women? Either you manage them through their physical death, which is sati, which is widow immolation, where make sure that the widow is burnt on the pyre of her husband, so she's physically eliminated, or through her social death, which is through the practices then of enforced widowhood, right? Celibacy and enforced widowhood, right? So, and we know all of these histories of how, Brahmin women were not allowed remarriage. They were asked to be celibate, no, tonsure, all of these practices, right? So whereas the excess man was not actually was not managed through much the same ways. You needed to find, therefore, because the excess man is also then seen as the potential reproducer of the caste. What you need to do is you need to actually find for the excess man another a possible mate. And how do you do that? Absolutely right. How do you do that? How you do that actually by lowering then, because you can't go outside the marriage group. What you then start doing is you start lowering the age at which people can marry. And so so you start going deeper and deeper in that sense into the marriage pool, into younger and younger girls, because the excess man's sexuality is managed in a very different way from the ways in which the sexuality of the excess woman is managed. And so child marriage, sati, enforced widowhood, all of these actually become ways of cementing cementing in that sense the structure of endogamy. Yeah. Now, so the question, because the question of why not remarry widows within the caste is because the question is also closely tied up to the question of the purity, the sexual purity of women, right? The widow is not sexually pure, right? She has already in a sense been claimed sexually, right? And and so again, I mean, if you look at the entire debate on the widow remarriage in colonial India, it's fascinating because people are actually debating which women can remarry. Okay. And there's a very strong current within the widow remarriage, who are saying, let's get virgin widows should be married off. So because child marriage is very common, and the consummation of marriage would not happen till the woman attained puberty. There were a number of child widows who were virgin widows, right? Because they had never actually consummated their marriages. Before they hit puberty, their husbands had died. And so within the widow remarriage debate, you have those who are saying that we can permit the marriage of a virgin child widow who has never in that sense consummated marriage, because she's still pure. Because also understand that virginity and sexual purity therefore is also a precondition for marriage, right? And especially as you go higher up in the hierarchy, sexual purity becomes that much more important for the ways in which the normative upper caste woman comes to be constructed. So the widow, who is in that sense already, now she's not a virgin, especially the widow who's not a virgin, who has had her marriage consummated, therefore is not seen as good enough to become a bride again. right? And so even within, I mean, if you look at the history of the Widow Remarriage Act, I mean, the debates around it, but also what happens after the act, you see that the very few widows actually remarried under the Widow Remarriage Act, and almost all of them were, child virgin child widows, sort of a thing, right? So this principle of hierarchy, therefore, right, and therefore endogamy, right? So and endogamy, and along with endogamy, therefore, the notion of hypergamy, okay, where what is still okay and what is still in that sense permitted is if a man of a higher stature marries a woman of a slightly lower stature, right? So it's also called anulom, right? Anulom, in the direction of the hair. What is absolutely prohibited then is hypogamy, which is, or also what is called pratilom, now literally meaning against, in that sense, the direction of the hair, where it's a quote unquote upper caste woman, or a woman of the higher status, marrying or having sexual relationships with a man of the lower caste, right? And you will see, and I mean, if you see in that sense, how this continues to in many ways inform our understandings today. I mean, like I was saying, it's not just therefore about understanding how caste and gender are interlinked. So, I mean, basically to say, the words are drawn from that, in the sense that where, in the direction of the hair, to say that this is normal, right? I mean, this is normal. Pratilom, against the direction of the hair, to say that this is something that is abnormal, right? Against the flow, right? So that's just the what do you say, the language, the way it is sort of framed, yeah. If you want to therefore see how this continues to, in many ways, structure our everyday even today, you only have to look at all of the cases of what has been quote unquote called honor crimes that have occurred, in India. And I mean, feminists don't call it honor crimes, because there's nothing honorable about it. These crimes which are committed in the name of honor, or as Uma Chakravarti calls them, these are custodial familial killings. Now, these are because young men and women are in the custody of their families, and these are custodial killings carried out by the family. But you have to just look at the cases of quote unquote what is being called honor killings, to see how this notion of hypogamy or pratilom as something that is completely, in that sense, completely negative, completely something that the caste order will not allow. No? So you still see, so in all of these cases, you will see that it's an quote unquote upper caste woman marrying, in that sense, a quote unquote lower caste man. Okay, and I'm using these terms in quotes because that is the perception, right? I'm not saying that these are upper or lower caste, and which is I'm using them in quotes. So this notion then that hypogamy is something that has to be completely prohibited continues to shape the ways in which, therefore, honor related crimes continue to happen. Or even in that sense, and now I mean, I don't know if you all have been hearing or following up, there's a whole debate happening right now about quote unquote love jihad and conversion, etc., etc. That the logic of that is also there. So those who see themselves as higher, men who see themselves as higher, cannot allow for their women. And that's, again, I'm using their also in inverted commas, because that's the notion, right? So these men cannot allow their women to have agency to choose a man who comes from a lower community or a lower caste, and they must prohibit it. And so if you've been listening to all of these arguments about new conversion laws that some states in India want to bring around, you will realize that this notion then of hypogamy is something that has to be entirely prohibited, but hypergamy is something that is still allowable, and not just allowable. It's also something that is in many ways, in some ways it's encouraged, not across caste groups as much as within subcastes of the caste groups. So, like for instance, in Marathi we have a term. They'll say you should get a daughter-in-law from a poorer family, but you should marry your daughter onto a richer family. म्हणजे मुलीचं लग्न वरती करायचं आणि सून खालून आणायची. society, right? That's the way in which it's. So there is a certain notion, because marriage is also a way of mobility within a caste society which is bounded. Marriage also becomes a way of upward mobility, right? And so hypergamous marriages, at least within, in that sense, the status groups that have more or less the same caste status, is still something that is encouraged. But hypogamy or pratilog, now, so the access to the upper caste woman by the lower caste man, whether it is through whether it is in that sense through their mutual consent or otherwise, is something that the caste system entirely, in that sense, prohibits, right? And so you see therefore that women then, so hypergamy, like I said, it's encouraged because that's also the way of social mobility. So it's not encouraged between caste groups. It's encouraged in that sense within the stratification of within the caste group, right? So within caste groups also you will have subcastes, and you will have status groups which have slightly differing castes. So the encouragement is always in that sense. So it's ours is not a society that is in that sense, it's not against social mobility as much as it is against any kind of mobility that would undermine the question of hierarchy. Now what happens within this sort of a hypergamous marriage, where it's an escalation of status, but within, in that sense, the larger hierarchy. So you don't cross the larger hierarchy, you don't become now, so I mean, you don't. So the hypergamy is not encouraged in that sense across caste groups, but it is encouraged in that sense within the stratification of the caste group and within subcastes, which might or might not have the same this thing, right? So there's a certain notion then, and as I said, hypergamy is permitted, hypogamy is entirely prohibited. Right, so the access, therefore, also see that also means in many ways that the access of upper caste men to lower caste women is also something then that the Indian society not only permits but also in many ways institutionalizes, right? And that will also help us understand, for instance, things like Hathras and others, which are then seen as business as usual, right? Because you have had, even in the past, in even historically, if you look at systems like the Devadasi system, the dedication of women, to temples, there has been, or whether you see it within agricultural societies through institutionalization of practices like the new bride having to spend her first night with the landlord, etc., etc. There has been actually an institutionalized attempt which marks lower caste women's bodies as always sexually accessible to the upper caste man, right? And so therefore hypergamy also codes itself within the caste society in different ways, right? So upper caste men have a ritualized, routinized access to the sexuality and bodies of lower caste women. It is the other way around, which is strictly policed, prohibited, and as I said, whether it is through consent or not, that is what is really a huge problem, because women now come to be the gateways of the caste system, right? It is through the control over the sexuality of women and who in that sense can access their sexuality, that the system of caste as a group, bounded group of discrete entities, is able to reproduce itself. And that's the only way, in a sense, that you can in any meaningful way reproduce caste. Because imagine in a context in which anyone is marrying anyone, caste as a structure completely in that sense loses its validity, right? So endogamy, and in that sense ritualized sort of endogamy, women of graded marriages is are major ways in which caste and gender actually intersect and construct actually each other.